It was the sort of June afternoon that seems to have wandered into England from an Italian romance. The kind of afternoon when even the bees abandon all sense of Calvinistic industry and dream atop overblown lavender, and rectors pause mid-sermon to consider the allure of gin and vermouth. Lord Peter Wimsey, reclining at an improbable angle upon a wicker chaise on the south-facing terrace of Grexley Hall, was indulging in two pleasures seldom enjoyed concurrently: reading La Débâcle in the original and being entirely useless. "Your French is improving, my lord," observed Bunter, appearing with that stately silence particular to butlers and well-trained cats. Though Zola may perhaps be an acquired taste in a sunlit garden, Bunter Zola in the sun is like a funeral in a conservatory, Wimsey replied, not lifting his gaze. One appreciates the incongruity. Besides, blood always reads better when counterposed with peonies. Grexley Hall was not the sort of place where one expected violent death, unless one counted the slow demise of social pretension, which had begun in earnest some time after the Great War. The house itself was a perfect specimen of neo-Tudor snobbery, gables, battlements, and other architectural falsehoods that had never once known an archer or a moat. Its owner, Sir Jocelyn Havering, was a man of medium wealth and maximum affectation, whose greatest achievement was to have once misquoted Horace in a letter to the Times and remained uncorrected. Wimsey had come to Grexley at the suggestion of his sister Mary, who thought the countryside would do him good, by which she meant she was sick of him criticizing her croquet grip in Belgrave Square. That he had agreed was less to do with health than with the opportunity to study the behavior of bored aristocrats in their native environment. "Do tell Havering," Wimsey said languidly, "that if he intends to poison me with luncheon port, again I shall begin carrying a portable coroner." But luncheon was not destined to arrive, for it was at that moment that a scream, not shrill, not panicked, but rather annoyed, wafted across the lawn like an opera singer who had forgotten her line. "Oh, for heaven's sake, someone do something about Mr. Trench." The voice belonged to Miss Hermione Beck, companion, critic, and occasional tyrant of the Grexley household. She stood just beyond the ha-ha, clutching a parasol like a sabre and gesturing toward the rose border with theatrical dismay. Wimsey swung his long legs off the chaise and adjusted his monocle with a practiced sigh. "Bunter, I fear the interval is over." They found Mr. Ivo Trench, an emaciated young man with the look of someone born allergic to enthusiasm, collapsed in an almost aesthetic sprawl among the Lady Hillingdons. His linen suit was uncrumpled, his cravat fastidiously knotted, and his face, so far as one could tell under the absurdly fashionable sunglasses, entirely untroubled. He did not, in fact, look dead. He looked as if he had made an artistic decision to recline. Sir Jocelyn arrived moments later, flanked by two dubious nephews and a gardener, whose expression suggested this sort of thing happened more often than propriety allowed. "Trench!" barked Sir Jocelyn, poking at the figure with a silver-topped cane. "Damned inconsiderate. You know I've guests." Wimsey knelt, examined the pulse, and raised one eyebrow with faint amusement. "Well, well, Ivo Trench appears to have fainted, though in the finest tradition of elegant deaths, I must point out he has done so without breaking a single button." "Fainted?" Miss Beck snorted. "Men don't faint, and he was complaining all morning about the heat. Said he never sweated, thought it a mark of breeding." "Indeed." Wimsey looked thoughtful. "Fainting is unusual in men who consider perspiration a vulgarity. Bunter, note that." "Yes, my lord, I say," said one of the dubious nephews, whose name was likely Roger or Nigel or something equally underwhelming. "You don't think he's, copped it?" Wimsey turned his gaze to the prone figure. "That would depend, dear fellow, on whether this young man's refusal to sweat is philosophical or pathological." Sir Jocelyn snorted. "Oh, rot. Trench wouldn't die on my lawn, bad form," but Trench, alas, remained stubbornly horizontal. Wimsey laid two fingers delicately against the throat, then the wrist, then the temple. At last he rose, brushing imaginary dust from his trousers. "I regret to inform you," he said lightly, "that Mr. Ivo Trench has indeed shuffled off this mortal lawn." There was a silence, a peculiar kind of silence, not of horror exactly, but of inconvenience, I suppose, murmured Wimsey, examining the rose leaves. "It's rather curious. He said he never sweated, and now he never will again. Curious indeed. Bunter, do make a note of the temperature, and if anyone remembers what Mr. Trench was doing for the past 3 hours, they might want to mention it before the police arrive. It seems I am to earn my keep after all. And with that, Lord Peter Wimsey turned back toward the house, already forming in his mind a dozen questions, none of which, curiously, had anything to do with the body. Sir Jocelyn was by no means pleased. That death had been so discourteous as to arrive before luncheon. He stomped off toward the house to demand both brandy and an explanation, muttering something about the modern constitution and infernal theatrics. Miss Beck hovered nearby, peering with unsympathetic curiosity at Trench's body, as if the young man might leap up and declare the whole thing a rather tasteless joke. But Lord Peter, after a brief glance to ensure the gardener hadn't begun pruning around the corpse, motioned to Bunter and said almost dreamily, "Time. To engage our better selves, old fellow. I fancy the answers lie not in the begonias but in the linen cupboards." As Bunter moved off with the efficient gravity of a man who could detect guilt in a servant's starching method, Wimsey wandered toward the drawing-room, where the house's minor characters were beginning to coalesce like iron filings around. The magnet of gossip. Miss Beck had already assumed her post beside the fireplace, her parasol now replaced by a half-knitted tea-cozy. "I suppose," she sniffed, "you'll want to question everyone. That's what you people do, isn't it?" "Only when they insist on providing alibis no one's asked for," Wimsey murmured, settling into an armchair with the feline elegance of a man determined to find murder comfortably upholstered. "But you're quite right. The whole thing demands a most delicate inquiry, as subtle as a lace doily. Might I begin with you, Miss Beck? A mere sketch, no more. A preliminary pirouette, before the main performance." She gave him a look that would have shriveled rhododendrons and folded her hands. "Very well. But I shall not be drawn into scandal. Ivo Trench was a disagreeable young man, and if he has dropped dead of his own volition, then I applaud his timing." "And when did you last see him not dead?" Wimsey asked, pulling out a silver pencil and opening his notebook with the air of someone annotating a sonata. "I passed him shortly before 12. He was on the south lawn, skulking, as usual. Reading Baudelaire, if you please." I asked him if he intended to earn his keep by weeding something, and he told me I was bourgeois. "And you replied?" "I told him that no man who moisturized twice daily had any right to criticize the bourgeoisie." "A fair exchange," Wimsey said, admiringly. "And afterward?" I returned to my room to write letters and mend socks. "I am not accustomed to being cross-examined, Lord Peter." "And yet you wear it so well," he said, rising. "One more trifle. Did Mr. Trench ever mention an aversion to heat, or indeed a fondness for keeping cool?" Miss Beck pursed her lips. "He was obsessed. Slept with wet cloths in summer. Claimed perspiration was beneath his aesthetic. A most peculiar person. Fought with Sir Jocelyn about the radiator last December. Wouldn't have it lit. Said he could feel his soul. Pelting." Wimsey made a small sound that might have been interest or indigestion. "You have been most helpful." He made his way next to the morning room, where one of Sir Jocelyn's nephews, Nigel it turned out, not Roger, was kicking idly at the skirting board and failing to appear suitably disturbed. "I suppose I'll have to phone Mother," Nigel said without prompting. "She'll be insufferable. Always said Ivo was unnatural." "In what sense?" asked Wimsey mildly. "Didn't like dogs, or billiards, or anything decent. Wore scent. Kept talking about the future of the human body. Some French rot. Said he was above evolution. Did he offend many people here?" "Only those with ears. Honestly, he was always moaning about the temperature, the water pressure, the breakfast tea. I think he half believed himself a martyr to civilization." "Did he quarrel with anyone recently?" Nigel shrugged. "Only the usual. Snide remarks over bridge, grumbles about Havering's taste in cigars. Oh, and he and Mrs. Carstone had a tiff on Thursday. Something about noise after lights out." Wimsey's brows lifted. "Mrs. Carston? The widow with the blue turban and the baritone laugh?" "That's the one." "Most illuminating," Wimsey said. "And yourself, Mr. Nigel, where were you between, let us say, 11 and 1? Library, trying to write a letter to my bookie. You can ask Faversham, he was snoozing in the armchair." Wimsey thanked him and moved along the corridor toward the back stairs where Bunter reappeared, his manner serene and hands respectfully folded. "Report, Bunter." Sir Jocelyn's valet confirms that Mr. Trench had declined luncheon and requested a jug of iced lime water to be sent to the east lawn. This was delivered at 12:15 by the second footman. He noticed nothing unusual except that Mr. Trench appeared perfectly composed. No perspiration, quite the opposite. He remarked with a touch of envy that Mr. Trench looked cooler than a church crypt. Wimsey tapped his lip with the pencil. "And the jug?" "Removed at 1:10, still half full, glass undisturbed." Wimsey nodded. "I don't believe in death without a little melodrama, Bunter. The poor fellow had no reason to faint, let alone expire, and yet he lies amid the roses like an Edwardian martyr to ennui." "There is one other point of interest, my lord." "Do go on." I inspected Mr. Trench's wardrobe. His garments were, shall we say, fastidiously chosen, but one item struck me. A sealed box labelled "Personal Do Not Disturb" stored atop the armoire. I took the liberty of examining the contents. Inside, a cotton vest soaked in vinegar, a bottle of something labelled "Spiritus Camphorae," and several hypodermic needles. Wimsey's eyebrows rose. Curious equipment for a gentleman who considered himself above biology, and yet rather in line with a man who would banish sweat by force. "Indeed, my lord." "Tell me, Bunter," Wimsey said, turning toward the window and the sunlit expanse beyond, "if a man refused to sweat, physically and ideologically, what then would happen if his body were made to overheat?" "I imagine, my lord, he would succumb most rapidly." Wimsey smiled faintly, not turning. "Bunter, I believe it is time we examined the boiler room." The descent into the bowels of Grexley Hall was less dramatic than one might hope from a scene in which murder was suspected and boilers were to be interrogated. The stone corridor leading to the utility wing bore the mildewed patience of a house, long used to concealing its secrets in subterranean gloom. Wimsey ducked beneath a low arch with the air of a man entering a crypt for tea. Bunter, lantern-like with a torch borrowed from a bootboy, stepped lightly ahead. The air was thick, humid, not yet oppressive, but close, like a breath held too long. Wimsey wrinkled his nose as they approached the heavy iron door of the boiler room, which stood ajar, as though someone had left it in a hurry or, worse, had never intended to close it at all. "Curious," Wimsey murmured. "A house of this ilk doesn't tolerate oversight. Doors are either latched or locked." Bunter pushed it open. The room was functional in the dullest possible way. Copper pipes, clanking old gauges, and a monstrous cast-iron beast that radiated a low, slow heat. The air shimmered faintly, and the faint ticking of metal expanding in warmth was the only sound besides the low hum of stored pressure. Wimsey moved toward the pressure gauge, eyes narrowing. "This model. It's not original to the house." "No." "My lord, likely installed just before the war, modified system combines central heating with the kitchen supply, rather modern for Sir Jocelyn." A man who quotes Dryden at luncheon yet tolerates new plumbing. One does wonder. He circled the unit, squinting at the dials and the feed pipe. Then his fingers brushed a smear of something dark along the edge of the flue. He sniffed briefly. "Tar," he said, "or some derivative thereof." He crouched, running one pale finger along the floor beneath the lower valve. "Sticky. And recent. And Bunter, do you notice? No lock on this side, which would be unremarkable, if not for the string. Indeed, a fraying length of kitchen twine lay coiled beside a wrench, the loop knotted but not broken. Wimsey lifted it delicately, turning it in the light. "Someone tied something off," he said. "Or someone. I wonder, my lord, whether the pipe in question might be—" Bunter paused to kneel beside a narrow outflow, fitted with a curious valve and a crude wooden handle. "Yes, this governs the secondary heat flow. Intended, I believe, to redirect pressure to the garden tap circuit." Wimsey straightened slowly, mouth thinning. "Imagine, Bunter, you are a young aesthete who recoils from perspiration, who speaks in epigrams and lives in linen, but beneath the drapery, you're fooling. Nature with vinegar wraps, camphor applications, and perhaps a pharmaceutical cocktail to keep your body falsely composed. What would happen if someone redirected a full wave of heat into your carefully curated little corner of the lawn? Say, into a pipe that you leaned against while sipping lime water and mocking the sun. An induced heat stroke, my lord, especially if your body had been chemically manipulated to suppress its own cooling system. The shock might be fatal. And would it leave a trace? Any more than the heat of a midsummer rose garden might? Not unless one thought to look. Wimsey's expression was unreadable. Let's not tell Sir Jocelyn just yet. He'd blame the Ministry of Works or the spirit of Queen Anne. But let's do ask about who controls these pipes. And, just for amusement, let us find this, Mrs. Carston. They emerged back into sunlight that now felt obscenely innocent. The house shimmered faintly in the warmth, windows catching fire in the high glare of early afternoon. On the terrace the scene had shifted. The footman, pale and useless, had taken refuge with a tray of untouched lemonade. Sir Jocelyn was arguing with someone over the phone about the delay of the coroner. Miss Beck had resumed knitting. And, seated with a peculiar composure near the sundial, was Mrs. Carston herself. She was not, at first glance, a figure of mystery. Broad, fair and efficient-looking, she had the sturdy composure of a woman who had once reorganized a parish fete in half an hour and frightened the bishop into punctuality. She greeted Wimsey with the faintly indulgent smile of someone prepared to be mildly amused. "I do hope you're not going to ask whether I poisoned the lime water," she said, before he could open his notebook. "It's such a bore being obvious." "Not poisoned," said Wimsey, seating himself lightly opposite her. "Boiled," she blinked. "Come again?" "Tell me, Mrs. Carston, you had a quarrel with the late Mr. Trench over a gramophone." She laughed. "Of all things, yes. He claimed the Strauss was causing spiritual degradation. I said if he valued silence so much, he should relocate to a monastery or a mortuary. I suppose one could say he took me up on it." Wimsey gave her a tight smile. "He wasn't popular." "No, he wasn't, though he had his admirers. He had that, what's the word, aesthetic cruelty. Some women find that appealing, not me. Give me a man who can hang shelves and make decent soup. And your whereabouts this morning?" "In the conservatory with Miss Rivington. We were pressing violets, a far less dramatic pastime than murder." "I'm sure," Wimsey said. "And would you know who might have been downstairs near the boiler room?" She hesitated, then said, "Well, I saw Maddox, the first gardener, coming up from there just after noon. Looked in a hurry." Wimsey noted it. "Maddox, not the usual footman?" "No, he was sent to fetch the lime water because the footman, Henry, had scalded himself, oddly enough. They switched chores." "Scalded?" "Yes. Said a pipe was too hot to touch. Burned his hand. That was shortly before noon, I think." "Interesting," Wimsey said softly. "Most interesting." And he rose, his silhouette briefly a sketch, of long limbs and troubled elegance against the blaze of the lawn. "Bunter," he murmured as they walked back into the hall, "we must speak to the gardener next. But already I feel the shape of this thing in my bones. Not premeditated, no, but deliberate, in a moment of wrath. Someone realized our poor, perspirationless Mr. Trench had built himself into a delicate prison of his own design, and simply raised the temperature until he could no longer live inside it. And the instrument? A pipe, a valve, a twist of string. Murder, my dear Bunter, is often just a matter of pressure applied to the right joint at the right moment. They passed into shadow, and the house, sensing inquiry, seemed to hold its breath. The gardener, Maddox, was a man of few syllables and many pockets, each of which seemed to hold a different species of soil. He was found near the northeast hedge, crouched beside a languid clematis, humming something tuneless and resolutely unconcerned by the disruption of polite society elsewhere on the estate. He stood slowly as Wimsey and Bunter approached, brushing off his knees with the self-possessed indifference of someone who had spent his life watching gentlemen come and go without altering the compost schedule. "Mr. Maddox," said Wimsey, with his habitual air of a man requesting the time from a bishop. "A quick word about plumbing and horticulture." Maddox scratched his jaw. "Sir Jocelyn said we weren't to disturb the roses." "Oh, I wouldn't dream of it. The roses are perfectly composed. It's Mr. Trench who's proving less. So I understand you were in the boiler room earlier today?" The gardener's brow furrowed. "Went down 'cause of the outdoor tap, sir. Pressure was off yesterday. Thought the line needed bleeding, didn't want the azaleas drying out. Sir Jocelyn's particular about them." "And did you touch the valve?" "Didn't need to." Someone already fiddled it. It was wide open, too much pressure for the tap. Nearly blew the hose off. At what time was this? 11:45 maybe, before the bell, just before Henry yelped, burned himself on the faucet in the yard. That's when I saw the valve was hot. Boiler must have been venting wrong. Did. You see anyone else down there? No, sir. But the door wasn't locked. Always thought that was odd. Never is, normally. I closed it behind me, but not latched. Didn't think to. Had my gloves full of cuttings. Wimsey inclined his head. One more thing, Maddox. Have you ever heard Mr. Trench speak of his, shall we say, dislike of heat? Maddox grunted. Oh, aye. Said sweating was for proles and peasants. Stuck his nose in the air and talked about cooling the blood. Daft sort of talk. Quite so. Thank you, Mr. Maddox. Your evidence has been more fertile than the compost. They left him frowning at his clematis, and Wimsey stepped aside under the shade of an ash tree to think, tapping the tip of his cane gently against a root. Let us list the pressures, Bunter. Mr. Trench complains of heat. He uses chemical methods to suppress sweating. He's delivered a jug of lime water, untouched. He is seated in the garden on a lawn known to contain a length of pipe, fed by a redirection, valve that was at that time fully open. The valve is scalding. The footman is burned, the gardener finds the flow wrong, and by 1 o'clock Trench is dead. Almost as though someone had engineered a personal oven beneath his lawn chair, my lord. Indeed. And yet it's not merely mechanical. It has a tone, a voice, the voice of someone who has suffered his presence 1 degree too long. He began walking slowly back toward the house, frowning. And yet we are missing the moment of intent. Someone did not merely wish Trench ill, they knew exactly how to undo him. This is no crime of passion, it's closer to poetry. Let's see if the verse was written by Miss Rivington. Miss Daphne Rivington, young, pale, and possessed of an unfortunate affinity for watercolors, was discovered in the music room, playing Mendelssohn with unconvincing urgency. She looked up as Wimsey entered, her hands pausing mid-chord with the guilty energy of someone caught sketching a vicar's wife in unflattering light. You know, Miss Rivington, said Wimsey, seating himself by the upright piano, Mendelssohn never liked heat either. But he never made it fatal. She flushed. I suppose you're here to ask where I was. I'm here to ask about violets, and perhaps a little about grief. Her face changed, the color draining in an oddly graceful way, like tea cooling in bone china. Grief? Surely someone must grieve Mr. Trench. She looked at her hands. I don't know, he was striking sometimes, clever, but he could be cruel. He knew how to make people feel small. He said terrible things and then smiled as though it were a compliment. Did he say such things to you? She didn't answer. Wimsey let the silence stretch like a cat on a windowsill. Then he asked softly, Did he ever ask you to help him, cool himself? Her gaze snapped to his. What? He was in the habit of using medicinal means to control his temperature, compresses, camphor, injections. Someone must have known. She shook her head too quickly. I didn't. He never said no. But he said terrible things. A pause. Yes. And this morning? I was in the conservatory with Mrs. Carston. We were pressing flowers. He walked by once, said, Violets with a scent of decay, then left. Ah, there's the poetry, Wimsey said softly. He left her then, returning once more to the scene of the crime, or at least its stage, the garden path, the chair beneath the parasol, the jug of lime water with a melting ice ring still ghosting the crystal. Bunter followed at a slight distance, silent but alert. Wimsey stood for a long time, his eyes half closed in the heat. Suppose, Bunter, you were a person with no regard for others. Suppose you considered sweat beneath you, but were not content merely to be fastidious. No, you made others feel lesser for their bodily honesty. You isolate yourself with disdain. Then you find yourself one morning overheated, sitting on a valve-fed lawn where heat surges beneath your skin. You do not rise. You do not cry out. You simply die, quietly, because your body has forgotten how to cry for help. It sounds like a murder by philosophy, my lord. Precisely. A murder composed not of violence but of contempt, of a precise and fatal understanding of a man's self-contempt. And now, Bunter, let us find the person who understood that contempt best. And Wimsey turned back toward the house with the unmistakable energy of a man who, having solved the equation, now sought only the final term, the name. Inside the morning room, the heat had settled like an unwelcome guest. Not loud, not obtrusive, but persistent, lurking in the corners, thick in the velvet of the drapes, humming in the frames of ancestral portraits. Whimsy moved through it as if trailing a thought that had not yet agreed to present itself. He paused before the sideboard, lifting the silver cover off a neglected tray of anchovy toast and sniffing it with an air of clinical detachment. "Anchovy in the heat," he murmured. "Some crimes commit themselves." Sir Jocelyn Havering entered at that moment, red in the face and full of bluster, like a man who had once been told he resembled Disraeli and never quite recovered. "I say, Whimsy," he barked, "have you any notion when they'll fetch the body? It's dreadfully bad for the garden party tomorrow. Ghastly optics." Whimsy gave him a look of mild amazement. "Optics, Jocelyn? One would think Trench had left behind a suicide note scrawled across your asparagus beds. It's beastly is what it is. And the vicar's coming to tea tomorrow. The man plays bridge with surgical precision. I assure you the corpse is unlikely to intrude upon your card table." Sir Jocelyn muttered darkly and poured himself a gin with all the dignity of a man administering penance. "Tell me," Whimsy said casually, "did Mr. Trench ever meddle in matters domestic? Heating systems, valves, plumbing schemes? Heavens. No, thought such things infra-dig. Complained about the tap water temperature once. Said it disrupted his inner equilibrium or some rot. But he wouldn't so much as tighten a bolt if the roof were falling in. So if someone had tampered with the boiler valves, it's unlikely to have been him." Sir Jocelyn blinked. "Well, no, of course not. Unless he were, what do they say, setting himself up for martyrdom." "Unlikely," Whimsy murmured. He was too fond of making others suffer. He excused himself, leaving Sir Jocelyn muttering over his ice cubes, and made his way to the servants' hall. Bunter had already taken the liberty of assembling the core staff, the housekeeper, Mrs. Dalby, a prim and skeletal woman who looked as though she had emerged from the pages of Jane Eyre, along with Henry the footman, and young Alice, the kitchen maid, who stood twisting her apron into a braided rope of nerves. "Forgive the intrusion," Whimsy began, "but I wonder if I might clarify a few timings. Henry, I understand you scalded yourself earlier." "Yes. My lord, just before noon. Thought I'd rinse the watering jug. Faucet blasted hot. Never done that before. Curious, did you report it?" "No time, sir. Maddox was passing. Told him instead. Said he'd check it." "And you, Alice?" Whimsy said, his tone gentler. "Did you deliver the jug to Mr. Trench?" She nodded. "Took it out just after 12. I was told to by Mrs. Dalby. Lime water. He'd been asking for it since morning." "Did you notice anything unusual?" She hesitated. "He looked strange, not ill, not yet, but strange. Like he was concentrating very hard on not moving, like everything was tight inside him. And the jug. Left it on the table beside him. I said good afternoon, but he didn't answer. Just stared past me." Whimsy thanked them and turned to Mrs. Dalby. "Did Mr. Trench make his request directly to you?" "Yes, quite insistent. Said he wouldn't take lunch, only the water. I thought it odd. Said the ice must be from the rear larder, not the kitchen freezer. Claimed the freezer ice had impurities. Ridiculous. But you complied." "Of course. He had a way of speaking that made refusal feel like a personal failing." Whimsy inclined his head. "He did seem to possess a talent for unease. Thank you all, you've been remarkably precise." Back in the corridor, Whimsy stood a moment, eyes distant. "Bunter," he said at last, "I think we have the necessary variables. The timeline is nearly complete. Now I must ask the question I have been dodging since noon." "Which is, my lord?" "Who understood him best? Who knew how much he feared heat, knew how his system worked, what he injected, when he rested, when he did not? Miss Rivington, perhaps, or Mrs. Carston? Perhaps. But neither had technical access, nor the opportunity to preset the valve before Henry's scolding. Maddox saw it open at 11:45. That means whoever turned it did so just before that, and then left the scene, which narrows the list. It does. And yet," he paused, "and yet I keep returning to Miss Beck." "Miss Beck?" "My lord." She spoke of his affectation, mocked it with precision, quoted him to me with mimicry so exact it betrayed deep familiarity. She's the one who called out when he collapsed. She was already nearby. She strikes me as formidable, but motive. She loathes pretense, and he mocked her values to her face. My instinct says she found his entire philosophy intolerable. Not just heat, not just sweat, but everything he believed about his superiority. She wouldn't kill in rage, she'd kill in irony. They ascended the stairs and found her in the drawing room, still knitting as though constructing a shroud stitch by stitch. "Miss Beck," Whimsy said softly, "do you know what camphor does when exposed to heat?" "Evaporates," she said, not looking up. "Turns to vapor, disappears without residue. Why? And when injected into a man whose system is primed to resist sweat," she set her needles aside, "he would die, not screaming, just quietly, as though his body had mislaid the instructions for survival." Whimsy sat across from her. "So you tied the valve open, didn't you? You timed it precisely so it would begin venting heat just as he settled in his chair. You knew he wouldn't move. He never moved when it was hot. He froze like a statue. And then he died. Because you raised the temperature of his absurd artificial world just enough to make it unbearable." She folded her hands in her lap. "Is that what you think, Lord Peter?" "It's what I know," he said. "But I don't think you hated him. I think you pitied him, and couldn't endure what he had become. A man who had turned his own body into an enemy, who feared being human." She looked out the window. "You're right," she said quietly. "I didn't hate him, but I couldn't listen one more time to him describe real people, people who sweat and cry and live, as ugly. I thought, if he wants to be pure, let him purify himself, let him rise above us, just not here, not anymore." Whimsy stood. "You understand the law will be less sympathetic." "I understand," he paused. "And I do believe the violets in the conservatory will press better now. Less humidity." She gave him the smallest of smiles. And Lord Peter, with the weight of a case almost settled, walked from the room humming something half-remembered and ancient, perhaps a lullaby, or a hymn for endings. The corridors of Grexley Hall had adopted that peculiar hush which overtakes old houses after a revelation, half mourning, half relief. A murder, once named and fitted neatly into cause and consequence, loses some of its weight. But the air still held something unresolved. Lord Peter Whimsy, descending the staircase with his usual feline elegance, was not yet satisfied. Bunter, waiting below with the gentle patience of an orchestra anticipating its conductor, tilted his head in query. Whimsy shook his head slightly. "No," he murmured. "She believes she killed him, and perhaps in some way she did. But the facts don't quite glide. The valve, Bunter. It was open too long. Maddox discovered it at 11:45, but Trench didn't take his seat until just after noon. That leaves a margin, 15 minutes or more, when the pipe was already hot. And yet no one noticed." Bunter nodded. "A most curious prelude, my lord." "Indeed. Miss Beck is many things. Rigid, contemptuous, brilliantly dry, but careless. Never. If she had tied off that valve, she'd have done so with all the ceremony of a Gothic heroine sealing a crypt. It would have been timed to the minute." They moved back toward the garden, now emptied of guests and gossip, where the parasol still flapped faintly in the breeze, casting long shadows across the scorched chair where Ivo Trench had made his final, wordless protest against perspiration. Whimsy stared at the ground, eyes scanning not for footprints, already obliterated by footmen and coroners, but for the subtle bruising of grass, the hints of movement unrecorded by human memory. "There's something here," he murmured. "Not evidence, no, something subtler, the feel of a mistake." He crouched suddenly beside the base of the parasol. There, embedded slightly into the turf, was a half-circle of scorched grass, just an inch across, and almost invisible except at a certain slant of light. "Bunter," he said, "a shadow doesn't burn grass." "No, my lord. But heat does. This mark isn't from the parasol, it's from something that rested here before it. A brazier, perhaps, or a box. Something hot. Something that had no business in the garden." He rose. "Miss Beck didn't do this. She hated the man, yes. She understood his flaw, but she didn't build him an oven. Someone else arranged the theatre and let her play the final scene." They returned indoors, past the yawning dining room and the closed piano, until they reached the narrow passage where the family's private quarters began. Whimsy paused at a door, Nigel's, and knocked once. The young man opened it with a look of theatrical boredom already arranged on his face. Whimsy. Come to accuse me of treason, or perhaps of bad poetry? I find most treason is expressed through poetry. May I? Nigel shrugged and stood aside. The room smelled faintly of shaving soap and lavender polish, and the ashtray was too clean. Whimsy made a circuit of the room, glancing at the books, mostly unread volumes of political memoirs, and at the desk, where a notepad bore the heavy indentation of a letter torn away in haste. Do you type, Nigel? Only with fury. Why? You wrote to your bookie this morning, you said, but the page is missing. Nigel's smile thinned. Are we truly hunting stationery now? I am hunting sequence. You said you were in the library at the time of the murder, but Faversham was asleep, and you had no reason to be in there. If the letter had already been written. So what, in fact, were you doing? Nigel's hands flexed slightly. You wouldn't believe me. Try me. I've spent a week with a man who wore vinegar-soaked shirts and thought sweat was an existential threat. My thresholds are elastic. I was spying, Nigel said, with a defiant lift of the chin. On Ivo, he was planning something. He had these syringes, files of odd chemicals, talked about transcendence, about controlling biology. I thought, he might poison someone. Ah, said Whimsy softly. So you followed him? Yes. From the morning room. He went outside, sat like a sphinx, and never moved. It unnerved me. So I crept round through the kitchen path and watched from the yew hedge. Just before noon, someone came to the parasol, set something down. A box, metal. I couldn't see. Who? I ducked. By the time I looked again, they were gone, and the box was hissing. Hissing? Nigel nodded. Like steam escaping. I panicked and ran back. Told no one, because I thought I'd be blamed. I've been in debt. The family already thinks me useless. And when the police questioned you? I lied. Said I was writing a letter, easier than explaining hedge-watching. Whimsy regarded him a moment. You didn't place the box? God, no. I hated him. But not like that. He was a miserable wretch, but not worth my freedom. Whimsy left the room without comment, rejoined Bunter in the corridor, and walked silently until they reached the small side parlour where Mrs. Carstone sat alone, sipping sherry. Mrs. Carstone, he said, may I offer a deduction? She looked up, eyes dry and alert. If you must. You pressed violets with Miss Rivington, but only after delivering ice to the kitchen. You saw Maddox near the boiler room, but you also passed the footman by the scalded faucet. And you know pipes, don't you? Your late husband was an engineer. You mentioned it at dinner 2 nights ago. Built heating systems for manor houses. She was very still. You tied off the valve, set the pipe to vent early. But it wasn't enough. You brought a heating coil from the tool shed, a gardener's frost box, plugged it into an outdoor socket and set it beneath Trench's chair. Controlled heat, quiet, no fire, just slow, inescapable rise in temperature. She said nothing. You let Miss Beck believe she had done it. Her contempt was convenient, but she was too exact to have timed it so loosely. Only you knew how to kill a man without ever touching him. She placed her glass down gently. He was cruel, she said. He told Daphne she was a failed experiment, said she would age badly, said I smelt of soap and church halls, said love was a genetic defect. I thought, if he fears the body so much, let him die inside it. And the law? Will say murder, perhaps it is, but it was also mercy, for everyone else. Whimsy bowed faintly. You understand I must report this. I do. And you will, of course, remain available for the inspector. I have nowhere else to be. Outside the sun had begun to dip, stretching the shadows of Grexley Hall across the lawn where nothing now stirred. Whimsy turned toward the road with Bunter beside him, the case closed but not quite at peace. It's always the temperature, Bunter, he said quietly. Either too much or too little, and someone always dies trying to get it just right. They left the hall by the side terrace, where the last daylight struck the fluted columns in pale bronze, gilding the climbing ivy and lending a spurious nobility to the cracked balustrades. Whimsy paused there, one hand resting on the stone, looking not at the garden, but at the clouds assembling quietly on the far horizon, like solicitors preparing for litigation. His expression was unreadable, less triumphant than contemplative, as though the revelation of Mrs. Carston's guilt had resolved the matter, but failed to satisfy the underlying equation. "She confessed, my lord," Bunter said at last, with the tactful firmness of a valet, nudging a distracted duke back into his carriage. "The means, the motive, the opportunity. It's a complete solution." "No, Bunter," Whimsy said absently. "It's an elegant solution, and therein lies the problem." Bunter waited, knowing the rhythm of these thoughts when they came, like the movements of a fugue. She killed him, yes, and yet she did not act in panic, nor was she inspired solely by pity. She built a system, a heating unit disguised as a gardener's tool, a concealed setup beneath the chair. And she timed the activation too early, deliberately. Maddox discovered the valve open at 11:45. That leaves at least 30 minutes of uncontrolled risk. Why risk discovery? Why begin the fatal process so soon? Bunter adjusted his cuffs. Perhaps she misjudged. Mrs. Carstone doesn't misjudge. She calculates. She presses violets and arranges funeral hymns in her head. She had another reason. They turned from the terrace and walked, slowly through the gravel toward the rear of the property, past the stables and the disused summer house, until the lawns gave way to the kitchen gardens and beyond them, the sheds. "Let us consider alternatives," Whimsy mused aloud. "Mrs. Carstone sets the scene, but someone else alters it. Someone adds an element, moves the chair, adjusts the timing. She believes she is the architect, but what if someone restructured the theater after she had gone?" "The metal box," Bunter said quietly. "Precisely. The scorched half-circle on the lawn. That was not caused by the boiler pipe. That was something independent, something supplemental. And the question becomes, who had reason to ensure Trench really died that day, even after someone else had already made plans for it?" They entered the tool shed, dim and resin-scented, the smell of linseed and rust. Whimsy knelt beside a storage crate marked "Garden Coils, Frost." One coil was missing, as expected. But the others, thicker, newer, coiled with near-military precision, were too many, more than the estate's grounds required. Bunter passed him a rag to brush off the inventory slip tacked to the inner lid. "Ordered March," Whimsy murmured. 6 coils delivered, only 4 registered as stored. 2 were put to use, early perhaps, or not at all. He stood slowly, brushing grit from his knees. "Let us speak once more with Miss Rivington." They found her in the library, seated. Beneath the great bay window, her face turned toward the gathering dusk. She did not flinch as they entered. "I knew you'd come," she said simply. Whimsy gave a courteous nod. "Miss Rivington, we have heard much of Mr. Trench's cruelty, but it is only now that I begin to grasp its extent. You knew of the injections, didn't you? The self-medication, the attempt to erase the physical self." "I helped him prepare them," she said, eyes dry. "He called it an experiment, said I was assisting in something transcendent." "Did he ever inject you?" She nodded once. "Only once, to prove it was safe. I fainted. When I woke, he said I had been impure, that my body rejected the refinement. And you continued to help him." She was silent. "Not out of fear," Whimsy said gently. "Out of hope. You loved him." For a moment she seemed to shrink. Not visibly, not grotesquely, just the smallest collapse of posture, the suggestion of someone folding inward, letting go of an unbearable weight. "I thought I did," she whispered. "Until he told me, after the injection, that I was a disappointment, that beauty without discipline was rot. And then, I stopped helping, but I didn't stop watching." Whimsy walked to the window. "You knew Mrs. Carstone had set the trap. She spoke of it to you vaguely. A plan. A reckoning. She didn't name it," said Daphne, "but I could tell. She moved differently that morning. She was determined. And you waited until she was gone, then you placed the heating coil under the chair." She looked up, startled. "How did you—" "You mistimed it. Just enough. The burn on the lawn gave you away. You meant only to ensure it happened, didn't you? You didn't trust Mrs. Carstone's method. You thought if he called for help, he might survive. So you amplified it, not the whole plan, just the certainty. She folded her arms tightly. He wasn't human anymore. He had erased it all. Laughed when people cried. Said, "Love was an error. He was eroding me bit by bit, and I wanted it to end." Whimsy studied her for a long moment. "Did you know that Miss Beck confessed?" Daphne blinked. "Miss Beck?" She believed it her own act. She despised him too, but in a cooler fashion. A moral protest. You let her carry that guilt. Why? Because she could bear it. I couldn't. Whimsy gave a long sigh. We must inform the authorities, but I suspect your confession will strike them as less criminal than tragic. He turned to leave, but paused at the threshold. Miss Rivington, one last thing. Did he ever write anything down? A notebook, perhaps? Some record of his methods? She pointed to the shelf behind her. Blue spine on the modulation of form. Whimsy took the book and flipped through it. Lines of meticulous pseudo-philosophy, diagrams, dosages, calculations of body temperature, cortisol suppression, glandular, inhibition. And on the final page, scrawled in ink too heavy for the paper, "The body must be denied." Whimsy closed the book. "Bunter," he said softly, "have the inspector sent for. But let us give Miss Rivington an hour. Just an hour. More." They left the room in silence, as the house behind them settled once again into twilight. The body had been denied, but humanity perhaps had not. The air had cooled imperceptibly as night approached, replacing the earlier radiance with a kind of silken quiet. A hush so fine that even the creak of Whimsy's polished shoes against the old oak floorboards seemed sacrilegious. He did not speak for some time as he returned to the hallway. There was no dramatic sense of conclusion in his carriage, no air of victory or even finality, only the slow, contemplative pace of a man arranging facts on the interior chessboard of his mind, careful not to declare checkmate until the final rook had moved. In the entrance hall, the long case clock struck the hour. 7. A soft, almost bashful sound muffled by the heavy drapes and polished stone. "Bunter," he said at last, "have the inspector been given the full sequence of events?" "Yes, my lord. I've sent a summary of our findings and Miss Rivington's statement. He's on his way from Market Dean. And the others?" "Sir Jocelyn is playing a morbid hand of solo whist. Miss Beck has returned to her room. Mrs. Carstone has asked for brandy and solitude, and young Nigel has taken it upon himself to supervise the coroner's assistant with what I would describe, my lord, as a misplaced air of command. Let him enjoy it. The young man will make a tolerable magistrate one day or a tragic poet, possibly both." Whimsy turned and walked toward the library once more, not in haste, but with the steady gravity of a man preparing to seal a box that had been left open too long. The library smelled of tobacco and polish. Dust motes, caught in the lamplight, drifted with the same indifferent grace that they had before the murder, as though death had failed to impress itself upon the architecture. Whimsy approached the fireplace, where a small pile of books had been gathered. Some trenches, some his own selections from the Grexley shelves, and one unmistakable blue volume, On the Modulation of Form. He sat, opened it again to the final page and read the last line once more. "The body must be denied." Bunter entered without a sound and stood by the fire, observing his master as he might observe a still life in quiet motion. "I find it fascinating, Bunter," Whimsy said, still studying the page. "How many crimes begin not with hate, but with an idea. Not a mad idea necessarily, but a clear, terrible belief. Trench believed the body was corrupt, that its messiness, its appetites, its functions were beneath him, a moral affront. He spent his life, or what he thought of as his refinement of life, in suppressing that, and in doing so he infected others with his disdain. Miss Rivington, my lord. Yes, she tried to make herself small enough for him. She believed his cruelty was philosophy, that pain was necessary for purity. A dangerous thing, Bunter, to mistake cruelty for clarity. He did not kill her with poison, but with erosion. And when she realized what he truly was, she didn't rage. She recalibrated. That's what makes it tragic. And Miss Beck? She fought with disdain, a higher moral ground. But that kind of purity is dangerous too. One sharp conviction away from action. It was Mrs. Carstone who tried to put an end to it, thinking she had done the hard thing. But Daphne made it final. Whimsy stood and crossed to the window. The garden was dark now, the lawn grey under a descending mist, and the place where the parasol had stood was just a vague impression, a chair-shaped shadow on grass that would soon recover. I wonder, Bunter, do we solve murders, or merely understand them? Understanding, my lord, seems the kinder ambition. A knock at the door interrupted them, followed by the quiet entry of Inspector Merricks, who wore the deeply apologetic expression of a man who disliked arriving after. The third act. Evening, Lord Peter, I understand I'm late. Only by about 4 motives and 2 confessions, Whimsy replied, offering his hand. Come in, Inspector, I'll give you the shape of it. He paced slowly as he explained. First the discovery of trench, then the pipework, the tampering, with the valve, the misplaced timing, and finally the revelation of the supplemental heating coil and Miss Rivington's confession. Merricks listened without interruption, jotting notes with professional solemnity and the occasional frown. Sounds like there's blame enough to share, he said at last. 3 different people believed they were responsible. Almost a committee. A rather elegant demonstration, Whimsy said, of how guilt can be layered. Each person thought they were acting alone. But in fact they contributed to a collective momentum, each tipping the balance slightly more. It's a murder by degrees, if you'll forgive the pun, Merrick sighed. We'll have to bring them all in. 1 for attempted, 1 for facilitation, 1 for completion. Might take a jury a week to decide who deserves what. They won't, Whimsy said softly. Not really. In the end, it wasn't about justice. It was about relief. They wanted the pressure lifted. They wanted him gone. The law may try to apportion guilt, but the house itself, Grexley, will simply begin forgetting. People forget well, you know, especially when forgetting helps them return to their garden parties. Merricks gathered his notes and nodded. I'll take Miss Rivington in myself, quietly. Thank you. After he left, Whimsy and Bunter lingered in the library, the fire hissing softly in the grate. The house had settled again into its antique poise, as if shrugging the event off its shoulders like a shawl. Eventually, Whimsy turned toward the grand piano and ran a hand lightly along the polished lid. I rather think we ought to leave in the morning, Bunter. Grexley has given us all it had to give. Very good, my lord, and let us take the scenic route back, through the Wye Valley, perhaps, something green and unambitious. I shall prepare the car. As Whimsy made his way up to his room, his thoughts wandered not to the crime, nor the clues, nor the closed case file that would bear his annotations, but to a line from Pascal, half-remembered, muttered under his breath. Man is neither angel nor beast, and the misfortune is that he who would act the angel acts the beast. He reached his door and paused before entering, listening a moment to the sleeping hush of Grexley Hall, the long sigh of ancient wood and settled guilt. Then he stepped inside, and the darkness received him without question. The morning broke, grey and indifferent. A fine mist clung to the grounds of Grexley Hall, like gauze laid over a wound, not to heal it, merely to obscure its edges. Lord Peter Whimsy stood at his bedroom window in shirt-sleeves, sipping strong coffee from a china cup with a crackled rim. The garden below was empty, pristine and entirely unrevealing. The murder no longer hovered over the estate like thunder. It had settled, absorbed into the fabric of things, as though Grexley, for all its gables and tapestries, had merely exhaled the truth and gone back to tending the hydrangeas. Yet Whimsy's eyes remained fixed on the gravel path where the coroner's van had rolled away the evening before. One last rut in the garden of appearances. He did not yet move to pack. There was still a tremor in the sequence, a dissonant chord. In the final bars of a composition he could nearly hear. 3 culprits had believed themselves responsible. All 3 had motive, means, and opportunity. And yet something in the timing, subtle, elusive, had not aligned. The body had cooled too quickly. The internal temperature, per the coroner's note, had dropped below expected norms by the time of the examination. If the heating coil had still been active at the time of death, the reverse should have been true. He turned from the window, sharp now, his movements brisk and deliberate. Bunter, he called down the corridor, delay the car. The matter refuses to settle, and I require one more conversation." The parlour still held the scent of cut roses and dusted wood polish. Sir Jocelyn, who had been absent through the more difficult evenings, now held court again with a pair of estate ledgers and a cigar whose ash betrayed nervous biting. "Jocelyn," Wimsey said with forced cheer, "may I trouble you for a few last observations before I retreat to less florid company?" The baronet looked up warily. "Good heavens! Wimsey, I thought it was all settled." The girl confessed. Merrick seemed satisfied. "What's left? A shadow, a temperature, a discrepancy in decline. I find myself less convinced by what happened than by when it happened." Sir Jocelyn laid his cigar in the tray. "You're not going to dredge up more suspects? We've only just begun to resume normal decency around here." "Quite the contrary. I believe the suspect may have been under our noses all along, only we failed to ask what, precisely, he had to gain." He crossed to the fireplace, resting one hand lightly on the mantel. "Tell me again about Trench's position in your household." "Humph. Loosely speaking, he was a guest. More precisely, a cousin's godson I was asked to give shelter to for a season. He had nowhere else to go. Lived off a modest inheritance which he mostly spent on colognes and obscure foreign powders." "Did he have a will?" Sir Jocelyn blinked. "A will? Come now, Jocelyn. You're a man of property. You notice such things. Did Trench mention heirs, beneficiaries, documents in the family solicitor's safe?" The older man shifted uncomfortably. "Well, yes. As a matter of fact, he told me he'd altered his will not 3 weeks ago. Said something idiotic about wanting to reward those who helped him surpass the animal self. I assumed it meant some idiotic sect. Or someone here." Sir Jocelyn narrowed his eyes. "Surely you don't mean to imply," but Wimsey had already turned away. The next conversation, held in the upstairs study where the housekeeper normally measured linen orders, was far less congenial. Miss Beck, seated at a writing desk with a blotter of sharp corners and brass-rimmed spectacles perched beside her, looked up with her usual surgical disapproval. "If you've returned to reassign blame," she said tartly, I suggest that your zeal for symmetry borders on indecency." "Nothing so dramatic," Wimsey replied. "Merely the pursuit of detail. A trivial question, really. Do you recall whether Mr. Trench ever posted letters during his stay?" She frowned. "Rarely. He preferred to dictate his venom in person. But did he ever request stamps? Envelopes?" "Once or twice, most recently, just after luncheon, some days before the incident. A blue envelope, I remember. Expensive stock. I remarked upon it." "Was it given to him?" "I handed it to him myself." "And did you see him post it?" "No, though I assumed he had. The hall box is emptied each evening by Henry." Wimsey nodded. "Thank you. That may be all." He crossed the landing to the footman's quarters, where Henry, still nursing his scalded palm in bandages and emotional injury, was polishing boots with one hand and theatrics with the other. "You emptied the post tray the day before Trench died?" "Yes, my lord." "And did you see a blue envelope?" "No, sir, nothing out of the ordinary." "Could it have been taken after you'd cleared it?" "I suppose so. Anyone might lift a letter from the hall if they had cause." Wimsey stepped back. "Tell me, Henry, were you aware Mr. Trench had revised his will recently?" Henry blinked. "No, sir, though I did hear him talking with Mr. Nigel last week about legacies. Didn't seem serious." Wimsey's eyes narrowed. "Did he ever suggest you might receive something?" "Me, sir?" Henry flushed. "No, sir, that is, well, he sometimes gave me little things, a bottle of scent. Said it suited me better than the brand Bunter uses." How flattering. Wimsey returned at last to the library, where the clock ticked away the last of the morning. He gathered his notes, read them through. Then slowly he drew the final line. The coil was unplugged prematurely. Bunter appeared silently. "Have the inspector return." "I now believe the death, though built by many hands, was ultimately sealed by one who acted not from cruelty, nor revenge, nor conviction, but calculation." Bunter inclined his head. "And Bunter—" "Yes, my lord?" "See that Nigel doesn't leave the grounds. Tell him I'd like one last game of chess before we go." There was no satisfaction in his voice, only the weight of resolution. The kind that comes not when justice is done, but when the pretense of innocence is finally dismantled, brick by genteel brick. The afternoon sun dipped low and pale as Nigel and Lord Peter settled themselves opposite each other in the dimly lit drawing room. A chessboard lay between them, pieces arranged in the familiar opening of the Queen's gambit. The room smelled faintly of tobacco and fading violets pressed in an unassuming glass vase on the mantelpiece. Outside, the garden shimmered with the quiet dignity of a place that had seen more secrets than roses. Nigel moved a knight forward with a calculated flick, eyes narrowing in that peculiar blend of boredom and concentration unique to those who believe their intellect underappreciated. Lord Ye. "Peter," he said, voice clipped yet eager, "I confess I'm uncertain why you requested this game at such a critical moment. Are you testing my mind or my patience?" "Both," Whimsy replied with a slight, arch smile. "Chess, after all, is the perfect metaphor for murder investigations. A matter of strategy, timing, and anticipating the unseen moves of your adversary. Tell me, Nigel, do you know what it means to sacrifice a pawn?" Nigel smirked. "I assume it means losing. Something of little value to gain a better position." "Precisely, and yet in life a pawn may be more valuable than it appears, perhaps even pivotal." Whimsy leaned forward, studying the board, but his eyes were elsewhere, flicking with the rapid calculations of a mind unwilling to rest. "You see, the case of Mr. Trench is like a game played by more than one player, on multiple boards. Mrs. Carstone initiated the fatal sequence, but the timing was off, too soon, too rough. Miss Rivington followed with a supplementary move, adding heat to ensure the demise. Miss Beck bore the weight of guilt, though unwittingly. Yet the body's temperature records suggest a final unseen influence. The coil was unplugged prematurely. Someone else intervened. Someone who wished to protect or to manipulate." Nigel moved his bishop, capturing a pawn with a swift precision. "I assume you are referring to me, Lord Peter." Whimsy's gaze sharpened. "Indeed, Nigel. You watched Mr. Trench from the shadows, as you confessed, but your intervention was more than mere observation, was it not?" Nigel's hands clenched the armrests. "I did what I had to. I knew he was dangerous, that he toyed with poisons and injections, but I did not wish him dead, not at first. It was when I discovered the coil beneath his chair that I acted." "And how did you act?" Nigel hesitated, then met Whimsy's steady gaze. "I unplugged it. I thought to halt the process, to save him." Whimsy nodded slowly. "A noble impulse, if misguided. But that act disrupted the carefully balanced sequence, leading to a premature cooling of the body, inconsistent with the original cause of death." "Did it matter?" Nigel's voice cracked slightly. "He was going to die anyway." "Perhaps. Yet your act introduces the element of interference, of chance, into a scheme designed to be meticulous and absolute. And that is the final move in this game, Nigel. You sacrificed the coil's heat, but not the consequences. Your timing cost. The investigators a clear conclusion. It also places you squarely within the realm of responsibility." Nigel's defiance wavered, replaced by something close to despair. "Then what am I, an accomplice, a savior? I am only a pawn in all this, Lord Peter." Whimsy smiled gently. "Pawns, Nigel, can be powerful. They shape the course of the game, often unseen until it is too late. You moved when you thought you must, but your hesitation and interference changed the endgame." They sat in silence for a moment, the ticking clock marking the passage of an unseen era. "Tell me," Whimsy said, "what did Mr. Trench write in that blue notebook, the one with the phrase, 'The body must be denied'?" Nigel shuddered. "Obsession, control, a madman's manifesto. He sought to transcend the human condition, to eradicate weakness. But in doing so, he destroyed what made him human. He was a prisoner of his own arrogance." Whimsy nodded thoughtfully. "And his death was the culmination of that tragedy, a murder by degrees, as it were. Yet, like any good game, it requires a final declaration. The question remains, who claims the last checkmate?" Nigel's eyes met Whimsy's, weary but resolved. "I do," he said quietly. Whimsy smiled, rising and extending his hand. "Then let us prepare for the final reckoning. There is a law beyond courts and juries, the law of conscience and truth. And it waits for no man." Outside, the shadows deepened, drawing a curtain over Grexley Hall. The game was over, the pieces laid bare, and in the silence that followed, the truth settled like dust, inescapable, inevitable, and at last complete. The following morning, the skies over Grexley Hall hung heavy with a fine drizzle, as if the heavens themselves felt the solemnity of what was to come. Inside the house, the atmosphere was taut with anticipation, a stillness that fell not from peace but from the weight of impending judgment. Lord Peter Wimsey arrived early in the study, where Inspector Merricks awaited, accompanied by a subdued procession of those who had played their parts in the tragic drama. Mrs. Carston, Miss Rivington, Miss Beck, and young Nigel Havering. The room, usually suffused with the scent of tobacco and old books, now smelled faintly of damp wool and nervous restraint. Wimsey greeted them with his customary quiet courtesy. "Good morning, all. We find ourselves assembled not as spectators, but as participants in a tale most unfortunate." The inspector nodded solemnly. "I trust you have prepared the facts as clearly as you promised, Lord Peter." "Indeed. It is my hope that the clarity of truth may offer some relief amidst the sorrow." He turned first to Mrs. Carston, whose face bore the composed resignation of one who has made peace with her role in the unfolding. "Madam, you engineered the initial mechanism, the tampering with the boiler valve that set the fatal temperature in motion. What drove you to this act?" She spoke steadily, eyes meeting his with unflinching calm. Mr. Trench's cruelty was a poison that seeped into every corner of this household. He derided love, humanity, even the very bodies we inhabit. His presence was a torment. I sought to end it, mercifully, in my estimation. Wimsey inclined his head. "A mercy wrought through method. Your admission is noted." He moved then to Miss Rivington, whose pallor seemed to deepen. "Miss Rivington, you amplified that method, bringing the supplemental heating coil to bear beneath the victim's chair. What compelled this escalation?" Her voice was low, edged with a fragile sorrow. "I loved him once, or thought I did. When he scorned me after the injection, I realized he was lost to his own madness. I believed that by ensuring the end, I spared others his torment, and myself further degradation." Wimsey regarded her thoughtfully. "The fine line between compassion and culpability is often obscured by pain. Your role is recorded." Next came Miss Beck, who met his gaze with her usual sharpness, though her eyes betrayed a quiet fatigue. "I did not act physically," she said firmly, "but my disdain and rejection fostered the atmosphere of condemnation in which this tragedy blossomed." "Words and silence can be weapons as sharp as any blade," Wimsey agreed. "Your testimony on the emotional landscape here is invaluable." Finally, Nigel Havering, whose shoulders seemed burdened beyond his years. "I interfered," he confessed, "unplugging the coil in an attempt to save him. My actions disrupted the precise balance, contributing to confusion, but not the death itself." Wimsey gave a small smile. "Your interference, though flawed, speaks to the complexity of human intention. It completes the picture." Inspector Merricks took over, detailing the legal ramifications and the weight of evidence. As the assembly dispersed, Wimsey remained, contemplating the quiet that had returned. He mused aloud, "Justice, in such cases, is less about punishment than understanding. Each acted from conviction, pain, or hope. And yet, the victim, trapped in his own ideology, was the architect of his fate." Bunter, who had stood quietly in the corner, nodded. "A tragic resolution, my lord?" Wimsey turned, eyes distant but clear. "Indeed, Bunter, and as we depart from Grexley, let us remember that beneath all the facades of civility lie passions and frailties that, unchecked, may kindle the darkest fires." The rain outside softened to a gentle patter, as if the earth itself exhaled, washing away the last traces of sorrow and sealing the tale within the ancient walls, ready to be forgotten or remembered as time saw fit. The carriage rolled away from Grexley Hall under a sky mottled with slow-moving clouds, the rain now reduced to a mist that softened the outlines of the familiar yet somber landscape. Lord Peter Wimsey sat beside Bunter, his fingers resting lightly on the folded newspaper, his gaze distant, as though the house's secrets still clung invisibly to his thoughts. "Grexley," he murmured, "is a monument not to grandeur, but to human frailty. Each brick laid not in triumph, but in quiet desperation." Bunter glanced across, noting the arch tone in his master's voice. "And the case itself, my lord? Do you find the conclusion satisfactory?" Wimsey smiled faintly, a smile touched with melancholy. "Satisfactory, yes. Complete, no. There remains an echo in the corners, the sense that in solving the murder, we have only begun to understand the nature of the man who died and those who surrounded him." He folded the paper and leaned back. Mr. Evo Trench was a man imprisoned by his own ideals, a prisoner who constructed a cell of linen and vinegar and cold logic. He denied the very sweat of humanity, and in so doing invited his own demise. But his death was not a simple extinguishing. It was a collision of wills, each participant contributing to the final act with motives complex and intertwined. Bunter nodded. A delicate web. A web indeed. Mrs. Carstone's merciful resolve, Miss Rivington's desperate finality, Miss Beck's icy contempt, and Nigel's last-minute interference, a quartet of human frailty playing variations on the same theme. Wimsey's gaze drifted to the passing trees, their branches heavy with fresh rain. It is a reminder that crime is not merely an act of malice, but often the expression of a soul's fracture. And it is in understanding those fractures, not simply condemning them, that one finds any measure of justice. A silence fell between them, comfortable and reflective, until the carriage slowed as they approached the village. "Do you think, Bunter," Wimsey said softly, "that in another place or time these souls might have found peace without bloodshed?" "Perhaps, my lord. But peace is as elusive as the mist that shrouds Grexley this morning." Wimsey gave a low laugh, the sound warm despite the gloom. "Well put, old friend. And now we return to the world of simpler puzzles and clearer truths. As the village came into view, with its thatched roofs and church spire piercing the grey sky, Wimsey allowed himself a moment's contentment. The case was closed, the players accounted for, and yet the human drama beneath the surface remained as inscrutable as ever. "Shall we find a fire and a decent cigar, Bunter?" "I should say so, my lord." And with that, the carriage rolled onward, carrying its passengers away from Grexley Hall's solemn shadows toward the modest light of new beginnings.